World economic powers express concerns over U.S. plans to pump $600 billion into the economy amid louder calls for reforming the international currency system. Will the U.S. be able to solve its chronic economic problems by printing more dollars, or would it be creating more problems for the world? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. Stuck in a sluggish and jobless recovery and with interest rates already near zero, the U.S. Federal Reserve has been forced to play one of its few remaining cards. It has launched the second round of quantitative easing, also known as printing more money. The move has drawn worldwide concern and condemnation, raising doubts about its impact on averting deflation and boosting jobs. On Wednesday, the U.S. Federal Reserve decided to pump $600 billion into the economy by buying back government bonds from banks and financial institutions in the hope they will loan that money out to businesses. The Fed has already spent $1.7 trillion to try to pull the U.S. economy out of recession, but unemployment has remained at almost 10%. While no one knows if this process of spending more money will work, it is almost certain to devalue the dollar. That should help U.S. exporters, but countries from China to Japan, Brazil to South Korea may introduce controls on money flooding into their economies, making their export more dear and creating inflation and property bubbles. And that's got investors pouring money into commodities. During times of uncertainty, they like to hold gold, oil, copper, which are seen as a better store of wealth than the world's reserve currency, the dollar. Gold is at a record high, while oil is at a two-year high. International reaction to the Federal Reserve's latest move has been anything but positive. The Brazilian finance minister criticized the move. He said everybody wants the U.S. economy to recover, but it does no good at all to just throw dollars from a helicopter. Meanwhile, in a press conference on Wednesday, the Chinese deputy foreign minister expressed his concern about the impact of the U.S. policy on the growth of the global economy. He questioned whether the latest move by the Federal Reserve reflects a responsible position by the United States as the main reserve currency issuing country.
I have seen much concern about the impact of this policy on financial stability in other countries. As the main issuer of a reserve currency, we would hope that the United States adopts a responsible position.
Let's discuss all this now with our guests in New York. Max Fradd-Wolf, professor of economics at New School University in New York. In Connecticut, Peter Schiff, president of Euro-Pacific Capital, a brokerage firm. And in London, Seijiro Takeshita, director of Mizuho International plc, an investment company. Welcome to you all to the program. Peter Schiff, we heard the reactions there from Brazil and China. Germany's finance minister has called this U.S. move clueless. Can the U.S. solve its economic problems by simply pumping more money into the market without being concerned about the effects it could have on other countries?
Now, you don't put out a fire with gasoline, and that's what the Fed is doing. You know, the Federal Reserve still doesn't understand the problem. Deflation is part of the solution. We have inflated asset prices. They have to come down. Trying to maintain them at these bubble levels is doing damage to the economy. You see, the problem with our economy is we've had too easy monetary policy for too long, and so we have severe structural imbalances that need to be resolved. But they're trying to resurrect a phony economy. It can't work because it'll keep collapsing. What we need is higher interest rates in this country. We need less consumer spending, less government spending. We need more savings. We need more capital investment. We need more industrial production. We need to recreate a real economy that produces real goods. But we're not going to do that as long as the Fed keeps printing money and keeps interest rates low. All we're going to do is destroy the dollar, create runaway inflation, and we will never get out of this mess. So we're going to have QE3, QE4, until the Fed understands that they are the source of our problems. And as long as they're stimulating with cheap money, we will never solve them.
Seijiro Takeshita in London, can the Fed's move kickstart the U.S. economy as it hopes it will do, or will it simply create more problems for the rest of the world?
Unfortunately, I think for the time being, the latter. I agree with the gentleman. I agree with Peter, and particularly from a theoretical point of view. If you look at Japan, who's had this experience before decades ago, the result is many argue that QE did get us out because it led to yen weakening, but there really is no proof of that. Basically, there is no proof that QE did reflate our economy or anything. There are lots of other variances, and this time around, it is very clear that it's inducing quite a lot of other problems, as you reported earlier, the international problems. Of course, the market is very, very impatient. They're always constantly asking for a lot of policies to come through, particularly the monetary side. But I do agree that there has been too much of focus on QE side. The fact of the matter is that this is the biggest mistake that Japan made, but they did not come up with the fiscal policies or re-regulation or deregulation which would induce demand. People is only talking about supplying the money and flooding the market. But the important thing here is to induce demand, to make sure that you do have a perpetuated industry with a good multiplier that would actually employ jobs. Unless we see that, we will not see a full sustained recovery. And unfortunately, right now, the problem with the U.S. is becoming very similar to that of Japan, which is lack of leadership in political arena. And this is a very bad timing at a time when you do need a top-down decision-making process, especially in means of creating new schemes.
Max Fred Wolf, then, in New York, should the United States be drawing lessons from the Japanese experience of the 1990s? They maintained their interest rates extremely low at 0% as well. That didn't help avoid deflation for all these years. Should they be drawing lessons from that experience, or should they be keeping the interest rates so low?
Absolutely, we should be drawing lessons. We should also draw another lesson, which is Japan is in a different situation than the United States, because about 90% of Japanese government debt, or JGBs, Japanese government bonds, are owned by Japanese institutions and individuals, and about 45 to 55%, depending on when you count, of American debt is owned by American institutions. So American debt is a globally held phenomenon. Japanese debt is a domestically held phenomenon, largely. So the world impact of these policies is quite different. I would have to agree that we've had overly loose monetary policy for a long time, and we've had it for the same reason that we're seeing the QE2 experiment going on now, which is we don't seem to understand here that it's not just always more response to the problem, but a qualitative shift, a structural shift in how we respond to our economic problems that big economic calamities always call for, that more isn't always a good idea, particularly if it's more of the same. And we have a situation in the United States where the economy is quite weak, where we don't want to do more fiscal policy because we've kind of done more of the same and gotten ourselves into $1.5 trillion budget deficits doing that. And so we don't have the political will or the desire to do more fiscal policy. We don't seem to be able to figure out that doing something different as opposed to spending more is a possible way forward. And so we're doing bigger and more of the same from the quantitative easing side, although I do think it will continue to have at least a short-term effect of increasing global asset prices. So there's another element here, which is this is part of an upward global wealth redistribution,
but that's interesting,
which probably isn't terribly healthy right now.
Let me ask Peter Schiff, why is the United States then doing more of the same if it knows that it's not going to get it out of its economic downturn? By increasing the monetary mass that's available, by increasing more money and allowing more money to float around for the same amount of goods that are available, isn't the U.S. government encouraging people to borrow more, buy more, and save less, which is one of the key problems?
Of course, all they're trying to do is keep the merry-go-round going. They don't care about the long-term damage that these policies are creating. We're digging ourselves into a deep hole. You know, the main difference between the United States and Japan is Japan made its mistakes from a position of strength. High savings, surplus, current account surplus. We don't have that. We're borrowing. We're the world's biggest debtor. We have huge current account deficits. And when we have a loose monetary policy like we are, and the world still maintains the dollar as the world reserve currency, we're exporting our inflation all around the world. We're causing other central banks to act recklessly because they're trying to preserve this status quo when they don't understand that the best thing for the global economy would be to stop propping up the dollar. Let the dollar sink so that other countries can be responsible and they can shift. Instead of like China, they make all these products and they ship them to America. Why don't they just make these products and consume them themselves? If they let their currency rise, they'll be able to afford them. Instead, they're constantly shifting purchasing power from their own citizens to Americans. You know, demand comes from supply. You know, governments don't have to create demand. Supply creates demand. And whoever can supply goods, they automatically have demand. In America, it's all phony. You know, we're not making anything. We can only consume things because somebody else loans us the money and ships us the goods.
And if this weakens the dollar, boosts U.S. exports while making imports more expensive, say Jiro Takeshita, do countries like China, Brazil, Germany, Japan and others have every right to be concerned because they know that the money will eventually not be invested in the United States at 0% interest rates. It'll be invested elsewhere, which will hike the prices and create bubbles in many other countries.
That's very true. I mean, that's one of the biggest concerns. But, you know, I think the most important thing is we should realize that we're on the same ship. The last thing that I want to see is basically this devaluation war that is about to be triggered, which I think the two other gentlemen strongly suggest. And, you know, I think it's very clear to everyone's eyes that other central banks are willing to get into the race. And certainly the consequences of this could be very, very grave. And another thing that, you know, I think one should realize that overflooding the market do not necessarily create demand automatically. Of course, I'd like to think that there are more discipline and rationale in Western financial institutions. But in case of Japan, for example, when they flooded the market with their QE, the result was that it ended up in investment in JGBs. And therefore, the psyche of the people who are actually making the loans didn't really change that much, unless you have those re-regulations or deregulations that would induce people to actually lend. I don't think it will make that much of a difference.
Will this amount of money, in addition to the $1.7 trillion that's already been spent in the previous quantitative easing measure, be enough, Max Fradwolf? Would it be enough to ease the pressures and allow or encourage these institutions to lend the money to consumers?
Well, we know that large corporations in the United States are sitting on record-breaking amounts of cash, north of $1.3 to $1.5 trillion cash on book. And we also know that an interesting thing happened across QE1, and there's every reason to believe it'll happen across QE2 here in the United States, which is that we'll see the federal government, through the Federal Reserve System, intervening in the market to make more money available and more money available cheaper. But at the same time, households will be not allowed to borrow because of their credit scores, or be frightened to borrow even if they have okay credit scores. Small and medium-sized businesses will be very tepid in their demand to borrow money, and banks and financial institutions will be nervous about loaning them money, because one of the ironies of QE2 is it sent U.S. mortgage rates to around 4%, an unusual, historically anomalous low. And what that says in a market price-based context is that it's really safe to lend to U.S. homeowners for mortgages. And I'm pretty sure the lesson of the last 3 years would be kind of the exact opposite. I would add to that, though, that the United States is not the only currency manipulator. It's not the only country who's been using interest rate policy to affect where their currency sits relative to other currencies. And there is a strange irony in a Chinese comment, however accurate, and I do think it was accurate, about manipulating your currency and being outraged about it, because after all, China's grown at 10% almost average the last 3 years, while the world has largely contracted, and their currency is exactly where it was 3 years ago, because they're pretty religiously committed to making sure that their currency is in no way, shape, or form any kind of reflection of the free market value that that the renminbi would have.
Peter Schiff, though, let me turn to this issue of the risk of more countries putting up protectionist measures if the United States continues to flood the market with more money, which will not be invested in the U.S. but elsewhere. Will we see countries follow suit? We've already seen Thailand, Brazil put up taxes on money that's coming into the country and going out of the country. Are we going to see more of this kind of trend?
Yeah. Well, I said we could. Hopefully, central banks, politicians in other countries will wake up. A currency war, normally in a war, the object is to kill the enemy. In a currency war, the object is to kill your own troops. So maybe people will realize that their citizens will benefit from a stronger currency, which gives them more purchasing power. And, in America, the reason that this QE can't work is because businesses have to borrow to produce, but they can't do that. We're still trying to reproduce this consumer-led economy, but consumers can't buy anything. They're broke. They're up to their eyeballs in debt. They owe money on their houses. They owe money on their cars. They owe money on their credit cards. So we need to rebuild a manufacturing and an export-based economy. But we can't do that with all these rules and regulations when we're trying to perpetuate the economy that doesn't work. So all this money that's being created, it's going to flood out of the country. It's going to go into gold. It's going to go into commodities. It's going to go to China. It's not going to be in the United States. It's not going to do anything until we have a hospitable environment in the United States, until we reduce taxes and regulations and have more of a free market economy, and until the government stops interfering. We can never have a real economy or a lasting recovery. So QE cannot work. Right? All it can do is make the situation worse. And the real ticking time bomb is all this money we're borrowing. We're doing it at a very low rate of interest. It's all short term. What's going to happen when interest rates spike up in the United States and the cost of servicing the debt is 10% or maybe more, and now the government has to spend $1.5 or $2.5 trillion a year on interest on the debt? What's going to happen when our creditors want their money back, when it's not just servicing the debt, but they want their principal back?
So what is the solution then?
Or are we going to inflate?
Is the solution higher interest rates then to discourage people from borrowing, individuals and governments?
Absolutely. We need higher interest rates. We have to let real estate prices fall to levels that are supported by the market. We have to get the government out of the housing market. We have to let insolvent institutions fail. We have to allow our country to restructure. We have to dramatically reduce government spending. We got to get rid of this deficit. We have an economy that only exists if the world is willing to support it and subsidize it. But the cost of subsidizing the American economy is growing every day, and it's going to bankrupt the world if they keep trying to perpetuate it.
And one key issue, of course, now for Americans is the high unemployment rate, almost 10%. It stands today at 9.6%. Seijiro Takeshima, does this represent anything more than a short-term fix? Does it even begin to tackle the fundamentals of the U.S. economy? Does it necessarily even do anything to decrease the unemployment rate in the country?
Well, I think, what you're now referring to is political agenda. And I think, what we've been talking about today is absolutely theoretically correct. The problem is that unfortunately in reality we have this political agenda where people are trying to get their votes, and of course unemployment is certainly a negative issue. And if you look at the mid-long run, of course the remedy is a painful structural reform that we need. However, that is extremely unpopular in the short term, I should say, populism of politics that we're getting right now. And all around the world, it's not only Japan or US, but certainly people are looking for a short-term fix. And that's probably one of the reasons why we're about to get into this race of QE throughout the world.
Max Fraud-Wolf, looking at it within the American political context, certainly the recent campaign, the midterm elections, we saw that a lot of voters sent a message to Washington that they were against increasing the government spending. Yet we haven't seen very many people, particularly politicians, of course, draw any linkages between the economic situation the U.S. faces today and the kind of massive expenditure over the last 8 years on the two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, now more than $1 trillion.
Yeah, well, we tend to have pretty enormous blind spots. You don't get into a structural situation where your federal government, like ours in the U.S., takes in about $2 trillion a year and puts out in spending $3.5 trillion a year. I do think that the QE2 might make the situation a little bit easier, particularly for asset prices over the next couple of weeks or months, although I think that was largely priced into the market in advance. And I do think part of what you are seeing is if you have a basic Keynesian mindset in which you're trying to manage the demand in the economy, which we've had some success with at some points historically, and less and more expensive lack of success with lately, then you have a weird situation in the United States where the fiscal policy response that we normally get.
But where does it stop, though? I mean, it's QE2 now. There are probably going to be sequels, QE3 and QE4. Can the Federal Reserve afford to continue pumping money into the economy?
I'm not sure we're going to get. I'm not sure we're going to get that many more sequels, because one of the patterns that we have seen is that we spend more and more money for less and less indirect economic benefit. We do have problems with our creditors. We do have problems with our political system. And at some point, if you fail the soft constraint and you can't control yourself and kind of find yourself to a different course, you find a hard constraint. And for many, that might be that the Fed is largely running out of ammunition. It's already run out of traditional ammunition for intervention. That's why we see QE instead of a normal interest rate or reserve type policy question. And we're also going to see the United States become kind of marginalized and be the subject of much anger at the South Korea hosted G20 meetings coming up. So the pressure on the United States is growing, the cost of this is growing, and we're in a situation where we spend more and more on this particular line of policy to get less and less out of it. And I think both politically and economically, this can't go on, it won't go on. And I think we're probably nearer to the end than the beginning or the middle of this process.
Peter Schiff, is the Federal Reserve running out of options?
Well, I mean, it's not running out of options if it's willing to take it to the nth degree and completely destroy the currency. But at some point, they're going to have to realize that the more QE they do, the more damage they do to the economy. The economy is going to be in worse shape when this QE comes to an end than before it began. And it's going to take some real political will to admit their mistakes and allow the country to restructure. Ben Bernanke and the Fed, they think they prevented an economic collapse in 2008. They prevented nothing. The collapse that we're actually going to have is going to be much worse because of all the actions that the Federal Reserve and the federal government have already taken. So until we recognize that fact and allow a real recession to run its course, to purge this economy of all these malinvestments, of all these misallocations of resources, we have to do that. And we have all these people who are unemployed. Unfortunately, wages have to fall in this country. We don't have the capital that we used to have. We have to have lower wages, but the government is not letting that happen. The government is subsidizing people not to work. You have minimum wage laws that need to be abolished. You know, we're not going to have a real economy until we have market forces allowed to work. And I don't know when there's going to be the political reality to bite this bullet. Because when we have to face the problem, we are in serious trouble as a nation, and it's going to involve a real change in government. A lot of people who are getting benefits from government, whether it's Social Security, Medicare, they're going to have to be told the truth, that they can't get these benefits, that the money's not there, that there have to be real serious reductions. And I have a feeling, too, that before this is said and done, we're going to have to restructure the national debt. People are going to realize that if you own U.S. Treasuries, you're not going to get 100 cents on the dollar. It is impossible for us to repay this debt. If we try, we're going to repay it with worthless money, and that's worse.
The national debt, which is now close to $13 trillion. Seijiro Takeshita, if the U.S. economy does not recover, where does it leave the U.S. dollar as the main currency for international trade?
Ooh. Oh, that would be a bit of an Armageddon scenario, unfortunately, because let's not forget that leaving away the currency, there are also the final demand of many of the nations that are emerging. And at the same time, let's not forget they're also the financial centers, and you cannot avoid a seismic risk from kicking off, the domino to start breaking down. And obviously, I think the result of that, obviously, is, regressing back into protectionism, which is the last thing we really want to see. Now, in case of Japan, I know very clearly that, during this process, many of the vested interests continue to hide behind the name of QE. And this is one thing that, I think U.S. and the rest of the West, I would hope would basically clear up while in the process of doing this, because what it does is it brings out a lot of tumor. It creates a lot of core of the tumor that would take decades to break down, which is exactly the phase that Japan is going through right now.
Professor Wolf, is there a long-term danger then to this kind of short-termism, if we can call it that, of U.S. economic policies, which tend to be linked quite often to electoral cycles, electoral deadlines?
Yeah, absolutely. We have an unfortunate and long history of extend and pretend or kick the can down the road, which tends to make the problem worse in the future. I would have to disagree with Peter, though. I don't really think that the wages in the United States, in some areas that's true, they're very high by global standards, but real wages in the United States haven't gone up for 30 years. And a lot of how we got into this situation is the American public continued to consume as though their wages were rising when they weren't. They borrowed the difference, right, and the world lent them the difference, and big American financial institutions lent them the difference because they were interested in having these people to continue to consume, and now they can't pay it back, and so now we have a weird imbalance, and a real rebalancing has to come at the cost of a little bit of profits, which is at a 55-year high, and at wages, and so you need a compromise,
but here's
and you need a facing and a reckoning, and I agree with Peter on that.
Right. The problem with wages is we don't have the capital behind our workers anymore so that they can enjoy the high wages that we used to have. And we have so much government regulation now that we didn't have that increases the cost of doing business. So it is very expensive right now to employ people in this country. We are uncompetitive. And unfortunately, something has to give. And if we're going to have all this government, all these regulations, and we don't have savings, so our workers don't have the tools, the only thing that we can do is lower wages. That's the unfortunate consequences of years and years of bad monetary and fiscal policy. And we can't get around that. And if we want to pretend that wages don't have to come down, then all we're going to have is unemployed people.
And that was the final word there. Thanks very much to all of our guests. In New York, Max Fred-Wolf. In Connecticut, Peter Schiff. And in London, Seijiro Takeshita. And thank you all for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. If you have comments or suggestions, please do email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. That's it for this edition. See you next time.